with us today, Sally Witcher. As I mentioned before, she was the chair of the Scottish Social Security Committee, and also has been really active in this zero COVID campaign. So, Sally, if you want to take the floor, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear and see me all right? Good. Thank you. Maybe just to kick off by saying that you know who I am. I am the former chair of the Scottish Commission on Social Security, which I resigned from because I felt the need to speak out about what's happening on COVID. I have a background as the Chief Executive of Inclusion Scotland and the Child Poverty Action Group before that, a PhD in diversity and inclusion. But my main claim to any authority on this is that I'm a disabled person and I'm myself at extremely high clinical risk from COVID. And I have been basically in my house with very few, I can probably count on two hands, the numbers of times I've been out in the last 2.5 years. So I am speaking from lived experience, and it is lived experience that is so often lacking in these debates. So I'm going to have a quick run through of a number of issues mostly around risk and types of risk and misunderstandings around it and what that means for community warm hubs, spaces, whatever we're going to call them. So we've heard a lot about action needed to make places safer. So I think it's important to look now at who we mean when we talk about community, as in community places. Who are they for? And who in the community in particular has needs for warmth and COVID safety? So who has particular needs for warmth and hence is going to be particularly badly hit by soaring energy costs? Well, people like older people, disabled people, people with respiratory conditions, and so on. And soaring heating costs will clearly also have a disproportionate impact on poorer people. And we keep hearing how they will be forced to choose between eating and heating their homes, when it's quite unclear how they're going to afford to either to eat or to heat their homes. And I think what's striking about these groups that are most have been made most vulnerable to COVID, they're not intrinsically so, is the fact that they are also the people for whom soaring heating and energy costs are likely to have the biggest impact. So we have there a bit of a convergence between the two. In fact, they are very often the same groups. So there always has been and still is widespread misunderstanding on the nature of risk from COVID. That's largely because governments have not only failed to communicate it, but actually seem to have gone out of their way to downplay and deny it and to politicize protective action. So on that basis, who exactly is at risk and what kind of risk from lack of COVID safety? So we'll start with what's always talked about, which is clinical risk. So these days, the myth is that the only people with underlying exceptionally high clinical risk, other than older people, are people with compromised immune systems. But while they are offered vaccination boosters that their bodies can't respond to by producing antibodies, they are denied the drug Evusheld that gives them antibodies. That is unless they can pay £1,000 or so per treatment, which of course a lot of people can't. Then we have, however, people with very significant pre-existing physical damage or weaknesses to the bodily organs and systems COVID is known to attack, people who were formerly on the highest risk list who were not offered spring boosters and are not eligible for antivirals, even though the development and efficacy of these were given as the reason for discontinuing the highest risk list. And recent research, which was published in The Lancet, confirms, for example, that people with multi-morbidity, that is more than one condition, should be targeted for additional boosters. But they, and many others, actually won't even necessarily get the autumn booster unless they qualify by other routes, like being aged over 50. So finally, though, the risk confronting anyone from long COVID has been well and truly shoved under the rug. ONS figures show that over 2 million people in the UK are experiencing long-term symptoms from COVID infection. In Scotland, the number of people affected by long COVID is roughly the equivalent to the population of Aberdeen. And with uncontrolled infection spread, numbers are only likely to increase. It stands to reason. And therefore, I've long argued that instances of long COVID should be treated as a key indicator, along with infection, spread, hospitalization, and deaths. So what COVID does, it causes microclots, immune system malfunctions and inflammation. It damages multiple kinds of systems and organs, potentially for the longer term. It triggers what has recently been described as a firestorm in the brain, like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. It creates long-term risks of heart attacks and strokes. And even in a situation where people seem to have recovered, it seems to be the case that people will still have a heightened risk of those for some considerable time after. And what we're seeing at the moment are sort of excess death rates that aren't necessarily attributed to COVID. And I just wonder how many of them, particularly things like the increasing evidence of heart attacks in young people, may in due course be discovered to have their roots in COVID infection. The other issue about long COVID, though, is that it isn't just about clinical vulnerability. In fact, none of this is just about clinical vulnerability, because the point is your clinical vulnerability only matters if other actions, such as on clean air, such as on exposure, and to mitigate that, isn't there. So it's a combination of the two that makes people vulnerable. There's nothing intrinsically about having a high clinical risk, or intrinsically even about COVID, that makes people vulnerable. It's about the failure of governments to use the tools that we now have in order to prevent the spread of infection. So when we're talking about, there are effectively two strands. You either try and build somebody's clinical resilience, that's one thing, it's about the person and their level of so if they do get infected, the consequences aren't so dire for them. Or you try and make the environments in which they're in safer. And it's that bit which seems to have been very often neglected. And there's emerging evidence of links between getting long COVID and frequent reinfection. Each time you get it, you're running that risk. And hence it should be no surprise that people working in frontline services like health and social care and teaching tend to be those most impacted by long COVID. So in view of the devastating impact on people's lives, the economy and essential public services, what are governments doing about it? Well, it seems Scottish Government's response is to cut £116 million from the budget for vaccination, test and protect, or track and protect, and PPE. And it kind of beggars belief. Action on ventilation, that has been some, it's been very half-hearted, and currently it seems to be proceeding at the pace of a comatose snail. And they could, for example, be doing so much more they could choose to be making Evishield available. They could choose to be extending booster eligibility. And it would actually mean overall, you'd be saving money on cash-strapped healthcare services. They seem to have an inexplicable aversion to things like HEPA air filters, which I simply don't get, and where still a lot of the ventilation advice is at the level of open a window and cut bits off doors, which to say that's a little bit unsophisticated is possibly an understatement. Anyway, the other thing, of course, has already been touched upon is the public health messaging from government is still based largely on the now known to be wrong understanding that COVID is spread by droplets of water surfaces rather than is airborne and spread by tiny aerosols inhaled like smoke. So while washing hands and surfaces is never a bad idea, masks and clean air strategies isolating, testing and isolating when you've got an infection rather than encouraged to struggle into school or work, if you possibly can, is going to be so much more effective in preventing the spread of COVID and ensuing destruction. So if we just kind of briefly cast aside for the moment, if we can, the scandal that in a wealthy country, millions of people can't afford to heat their own homes, while energy companies record billions of pounds of profit. If you are looking to destroy as many lives as possible, bring the economy, public healthcare, social care and education service to their knees, I think sometimes you struggle to think what else governments might do. And the fact that it's done indirectly, very often, by inaction and omission, by failure to collect and communicate data on risk and impact, and also in the guise of giving people choice and freedom, makes it harder to see what's going on and harder to challenge. In fact, it goes so far, you could argue, of there being deliberate doublespeak and misdirection. We had it drummed into us in the early days that we were to protect the NHS. And look what government is now doing to the NHS through its action and inaction. It's overwhelming it and it's falling apart. So if we're to avoid community places turning into super spreader centres, everyone needs to get the blinkers off and their heads out the sand, or that is what is going to happen. Instead, we should all work, or could all be working, to make community warm hubs models of good practice on COVID safety. If governments refuse to lead and take responsibility for keeping safe the people whose health and well-being and whose interest it is actually their job to represent and promote, maybe local communities will need to lead instead. But could that be, and this is not an argument against it by a long shot, but could it be that that is precisely the agenda in the quest to roll back the frontiers of the state, and with it, the protections and enforcements, and the possibility of enforcing rights and protections from exploitation and profiteering, that is what the state can provide, and only the state really, and the legal system can provide. So this is kind of where we are. There are currently two new variants emerging from what was a super variant that look like they are going to take off. At the moment, there's a bit of a lull, but the prognosis for COVID and COVID safety is not good. There is so much that could be done, and I have been working very hard, and I know a lot of people have, and certainly Zerocovid Scotland people have, also providing a lot of support to each other, because these are incredibly difficult times. So many people are not being heard, are really suffering, and it's the frustration, the rage at knowing that this is being done to you, that vulnerability is not to do with you, it's not to do with your clinical condition, it's not to do with COVID anymore. It was initially, but it is the failure of governments to use the tools and to communicate risk so that sensible people, well-meaning people, understand fully the risks that they are taking for themselves, for their loved ones, and are imposing on other people. Because at the moment, I don't think people necessarily do understand it. But that is what's happening. And I have been trying to work for what I termed a while ago, an inclusive new normal. So let's start turning this round. Let's start turning this round to think, right, okay, this is where we are. What can we do? Because it doesn't have to be like that. We heard a lot about build back better. Do you remember that? And look where we've ended up. Well, actually, we could build back better. There were even some positives that came out of COVID, such as scope to do things online, which opened up access for all kinds of people. So let's try and find what we can and keep the focus on action that could be done and should be done, and making sure that the voices of people, unpaid carers are well in the mix there as well, are being heard and being listened to, because it's that experience that should be driving what happens, and bearing in mind that it isn't just us, as in the people I've mentioned. it's everybody. It's the people with long COVID. It's everybody who is at risk with long COVID. And actually that means you. Thank you.